Okay, I've asked Mike Herendeen to give us he happens to be a lawyer, and happens to be deputy supervisor for Middlebury Township, but he's pretty open as far as dealing with the other lawyers at our meetings, I feel, and he's just going to give you a quick summary as to where we are, I guess you'd say that, and we're not going to be meeting again till March 12th, but go ahead.
I'll just try to give a brief summary, and then I guess respond to questions. That might be the easiest way. And bear in mind, as deputy supervisor for Middlebury Township, I do come from that perspective. In any negotiations or anything like that, I do represent Middlebury Township, and what at least is perceived to be their interest. Ideally, we're talking about service contracts between, there would actually be two of them, one of them between Omesa and Middlebury Township, and one between Omesa and Obey Township. This has to do with the rebidding over of the millages. A careful reading of the Articles of Incorporation would clearly indicate that it was, in my opinion, it was originally anticipated that Omesa was going to levy the millages. Therefore, no provision was made, particularly for whether or not one of the townships would pay over the millages once they were levied. If Omesa had levied it, it wouldn't have mattered. They simply would, Omesa would have had it whether a township wanted to participate or not. But when the time came, the townships did them in separate millages, and they were levied by the township. At some point, when there were some hard feelings or whatever, we got sort of an ultimatum from Obey Township that they weren't going to leave Omesa, but at the same time they weren't going to pay their millage. Now, as a personal matter, I consider that a little dubious as whether that would hold up.
Stand corrected, though.
Go ahead.
No time did Obey Township say they weren't paying their money.
Okay, I'll just leave it. I'm just giving my perception from Middlebury Township.
But I want to clarify that, because at no time did they ever say they weren't going to pay their share.
Well, I don't know, but at any rate. But they did have a point in that if you don't have, if it's not written in the Articles of Incorporation about paying it over, what happens if somebody doesn't? So we entered into negotiations to draw up contracts. Contracts are the way that it is done in situations where you do have townships that have their own millage, and they're going to combine them into a single authority. Basically, this is where we're at right now, roughly. And let me address, before I say that, let me address that we do have to talk about the Articles of Incorporation, because that is the context for negotiating the contracts. The contracts have to follow. Now, we can make suggestions for changing Articles of Incorporation, especially in an area like the remitting over of the millages, because that's an area that, as I pointed out, the original Articles of Incorporation basically didn't contemplate. Again, I was probably presuming that Omesa was going to levy the millage. So we do talk about those things. Ultimately, any change in Articles of Incorporation would have to be made by the individual entities all voting. They'd have to all approve it. Frankly, everything we're talking about could be done in the contracts, and it may end up being that way. But some of them actually, for I think everybody's sake, but certainly for Middlebury Townships, would be better if they were incorporated into the Articles of Incorporation. But they could be done in the contracts. What they're looking at in the way of the contracts is that a capital expenditure of over $350,000 would only be based on a vote of Omesa of at least 5 members. This goes in line with one of our goals, as we saw it, was not to spend unnecessarily on large items or overspend on them if you do need them. From our point of view, you would probably, for anything that large, you would probably need 5. I don't think either side was interested in forcing it down the other side's throat, even if they happen to have 4 votes. If one of the 2 townships was completely dead set against it, it'd be pretty hard to do it, even if 4 people wanted to. So it wasn't looked at as that being that big a deal. The important to us was a provision that the failure to, at any point, to turn over the millages would be considered a withdrawal under Article 13 of the Articles of Incorporation, with everything that means. That, for those of you who've read the Articles of Incorporation, you know that Article 13 withdrawal includes forfeiture of any property or anything like that. That was pretty important to us because that is the item that I believe would help stabilize funding for Omesa and let them make plans on what's coming. The actual mechanism for doing that would be an entity, be it Middlebury Township or Ovid Township, who was more than 30 days in arrears. At that point, the representatives of that entity wouldn't be able to participate on the Omesa board, and the quorum could be formed from the remaining trustees, who could then make a demand of the entity that was in arrears, and upon further non-payment up to 30 more days, could declare and determine that they had withdrawn. So that's pretty important, and that's language to that effect is going to be pretty important in Middlebury Township. Other things are the length of the contracts, and both the 2 townships have made it clear they want the contract to be contingent upon the other township also having their contract remaining in effect. That's not uncommon in these things. Because the contract actually is between the actual entity and Omesa, you wouldn't want to be left in a contract if the other one had withdrawn. I do want to address one thing I heard in the letter about the $5 per capita. That was not there was no motion to not pay that. That's something that's done ad hoc. That's not in the Articles of Incorporation. It's done from time to time, and they've pretty much done it consistently. And I can speak, at least from Middlebury Township standpoint, we're not opposed to doing it from time to time. But we just, because they had done it that way, voting on it from time to time as they saw fit, we didn't feel it should be in the contracts, that's all. It wasn't a motion not to pay it. That can be done at any time between the parties. Any 2 parties to a contract can always agree to anything. And one of them may be a $5 a head levy or assessment. I guess maybe I can just respond to questions from the board or Albert.
What length of contracts are being discussed? What's been put forward?
Right. Well, so far, we had originally started with 5 years, but they would have an automatic renewal. In talking with the chairman of Omesa, Mr. Siemens, and also considering the possibility that we may do this completely in the contracts, I think there's a sentiment for insisting on 13 years. In other words, to the end of the millage period. Bear in mind, if Omesa had levied this millage, that would have been the fact. The millage would have gone 13 years, and neither side would have unilaterally been able to end it. Well, I think the contract should have the same effect then, especially if we're going to put in the provision about withdrawal. I don't want to run on to a 5 or 6 year period and have a notice put in for ending it and have to get into a debate about whether that ends the obligation for remitting. So that's where, right now we're talking about 5 years with automatic renewals. I think at least from Middlebury Township standpoint, we want to insist on a longer contract to the end of the millage period.
When we talked about this,